Welcome to Lesson 2 in our learning of the grammar of Biblical Aramaic. Today we will talk about the parts of speech in Biblical Aramaic, and you can find a more detailed treatment of the parts of speech of Aramaic in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 6 and 7. Let's get started. This diagram graphically displays the different kinds of parts of speech we encounter in Biblical Aramaic and attempts to display also the relationship between them. At the outset, we can say this system is actually easier, less complicated than the parts of speech system in Hebrew. So if we have a good grasp on the Biblical Hebrew parts of speech and their interrelationship, we should have an easier time getting a grasp on the Aramaic parts of speech. You will also notice in this diagram that some of the categories overlap, the circles and the ovals, and there are these red arrows drawn from nouns to adjectives and verbs. This is an attempt to graphically display the relationship between these kinds of parts of speech. So we will get into the details of that in our quick survey. First, let's discuss particles. It's a catch-all category for elements of grammar that don't readily fall into these other major categories. So what are examples of particles in Biblical Aramaic? They're familiar from our Hebrew study. They are particles of existence, conjunctions, the relative clause marker, the direct object marker, interrogatives, and prepositions. So that's way too much to put in that red oval on this diagram, but we can look forward to learning about each of those kinds of particles in lessons ahead. Next, let's look over here at nouns. You'll notice within the nouns circle that there are other words that are put in a lighter gray font. This is because there are concepts that are related to nouns that we also want to make sure to include in our overall survey of nouns. These are pronouns, for instance, which grammatically substitute for nouns in sentences. And what we mean is that pronouns can perform the grammatical role of nouns while substituting for them. And in Biblical Aramaic, just as in Biblical Hebrew, there are two systems of pronouns: an independent pronoun system in which the pronouns are independent words, as well as a suffix system in which the pronouns attach as suffixes to other kinds of words. We also want to take note that nouns in Biblical Aramaic have gender and number. The genders of nouns in Biblical Aramaic are masculine and feminine. The gender system of nouns is a noun classification system that is widespread in world languages, and in fact not even limited to masculine and feminine, so we should be thankful that there are only two genders to know about in Biblical Aramaic. Regarding number, nouns in Biblical Aramaic are singular, dual, and plural. We will study more about these details when we talk about nouns. Next, let's discuss adjectives. You can see the red arrow going from the nouns circle over to the adjectives circle. Along with that is the red agreement word on the screen and the little G/N. The meaning of this is that nouns require gender and number agreement from the adjectives that are associated with them. So we should expect there to be inflections on adjectives that will signal this agreement. Next, we see verbs. It's a large circle, isn't it? This is because verbal systems of languages are extremely important to the overall grammar and syntax of languages. Different languages express verbal ideas in different ways, and we notice there are quite a few concepts within this circle that we'll be talking about when we discuss the Biblical Aramaic verbal system. For example, starting at the top, we see dynamic and stative verbs. Dynamic verbs describe actions. This might be what we first think about from perhaps a native English speaker's perspective about what verbs do. But Biblical Aramaic, just like Biblical Hebrew, also has a type of verb called stative verbs, which are laying out some sort of state that the subject is in or was in at some time. That's the difference between dynamic and stative verbs. And the difference is sometimes reflected in the vowel patterns seen in verbs. So that's an important category of meaning that we should not forget. Notice also the red arrow extending from the noun circle over to the verb circle. This is because nouns require person, gender, and number agreement from verbs for which they serve as subjects. That is to say, the noun that's serving as the subject of a verb will require these kinds of morphological agreement from those verbs. Next, tense, aspect, and modality. These ideas are closely related with the verbal systems of the languages of the world. Tense is a familiar concept for native English speakers, and it has to do with time. That is to say, when an action is taking place with respect to some sort of reference time, whether it's the time of speaking or some other reference time. Aspect has to do with the way a verb action or state takes place or extends through time. And it might be a more complex verbal idea than tense for a native English speaker, but we've probably already seen treatment of aspect as we have studied Biblical Hebrew. And then next, modality. Modality has to do with the so-called real world versus the irreal. That is to say, any expression that discusses the world of potential in any sort of way has to do with modality. And if you monitor your way of talking as you go through the day, you'll notice you actually use modality a great deal because we tend to shade everything we say in terms of potential. What else do we see in the verb circle? Well, under the word verbs there, we see stems. The Hebrew word for stems is the binyanim. Interestingly, this is an Aramaic word, binyan, which means structure. And we can see that in the glossary of Biblical Aramaic for biblical interpreters. This word appears in Ezra. The stems of Biblical Aramaic verbs are similar in function to the stems of Biblical Hebrew verbs. So we'll be able to use some of the intuition we've built up regarding the meaning of these stems from our Hebrew study. Biblical Aramaic, like Biblical Hebrew, expresses the concept of grammatical voice through the stem system. Perhaps the easiest to grasp voice ideas are active and passive voice, for instance. This is very clearly reflected in the stem system. We also notice perfect and imperfect in the gray font. This is because, just like with Hebrew, there are two main verb types in Biblical Aramaic grammar, the perfect and the imperfect. It's possible to use other names for these two verb types, but it's also common practice when you're comparing Semitic languages to try to use similar terms so you don't get lost by using language-specific terms. So that's why we've chosen to use perfect and imperfect for these two verb types. And of course, we will discuss their function in more depth later. And you'll notice volitionals is under imperfect. That is because the so-called volitional verb forms expressing will of the speaker or the author or some literary character in some way are taken from the imperfect verb form, and there's a modification to it to express these special volitional ideas. In Hebrew, we saw the volitional idea with the first person cohortative, the second person imperative, and the second and third person jussive. Aramaic has a similar system of volitionals that we will study. Now, just a special note, what do we not see in the verb system of Aramaic that we would have spent some time on in Hebrew? We do not see any of the vav prefix verb forms, a layer of complexity to be sure, but a commonly seen attribute of the biblical Hebrew verbal system. It's not present in biblical Aramaic. So this is one way that Aramaic's grammar is simpler than that of Hebrew. Okay, let's look up top with the blue oval labeled verbal noun. There is only one kind of infinitive in biblical Aramaic versus the two of biblical Hebrew. You may remember the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute. It is not technically correct to refer to the biblical Aramaic infinitive as the infinitive construct. Therefore, we will call it the infinitive. However, it more closely approximates what the infinitive construct does in biblical Hebrew. Now, this oval overlaps the noun circle and the verb circle because the infinitive is a grammatical category of verbal noun. That is to say, in some of its uses, it's noun-like. In some of its uses, it's verb-like. So it occupies the middle ground between nouns and verbs. And then, lastly, verbal adjectives, participles. Just as in biblical Hebrew, biblical Aramaic participles span several categories. That is to say, the noun category, adjective category, and verb category. This is because at their root, participles are indeed adjectives, and adjectives, broadly speaking, have attributive uses, which is to say, to comment on the attributes of nouns, predicative uses, in which participles will take the place of verbs. And in fact, in biblical Aramaic, participles play an even greater role in the verbal system than they do in the biblical Hebrew verbal system. And finally, verbal adjectives, participles, can substitute for nouns. That is to say, to play the role of a noun, grammatically speaking, in a sentence. Well, that brings us through a very quick and very broad tour of the kinds of parts of speech that we will encounter in biblical Aramaic. This should have been quite familiar information, familiar from the study of biblical Hebrew. And in fact, we'll be able to use this knowledge we already have to understand biblical Aramaic parts of speech better. Not only are there similarities, of course, but also differences in use. So thank you for joining me for this quick lesson on the parts of speech of Aramaic. I look forward to lesson 3.